This is the program Red Hook 3-1 for Tuesday, June 29th, 1948. Hello? Yes, this is Red Hook 3-1. That's right, 3 shorts and a long, and this is Woody Klose.
And Virginia.
And we're transcribing, chatting as usual, directly from the nice, cozy red, white, and blue kitchen of our home, Echo Valley Farm, at Red Hook in Dutchess County, New York.
Wasn't it too bad, Woody, that the hands of our big kitchen clock went round so fast yesterday that we could hardly get time to finish our story. In fact, we just got in the middle of our story about the lovely recital and tea that we went to at Mrs. Franklin Delano Roosevelt's Hyde Park home, Valkill Cottage, on Saturday. So I think we should tell all of our friends about the rest of the party today. And, of course, they're going to hear Mrs. Roosevelt's own remarks, some of them later.
That's exactly right, Virginia. It's too bad that clock goes around so fast that we can't talk about our own life as well as Mrs. Roosevelt's party and the recital and everything that happened there. But, gee whiz, we just seem to be burdened by time, don't we?
I know, time.
We're clock watchers, really.
I'm afraid we are. But we weren't clock watchers on Saturday afternoon when we sat in that lovely pine-paneled living room at Hyde Park. And as we told you, I think we just about got up to the point just before Mrs. Roosevelt's talk where we described the living room and all the setup as we came in. And the pine-panel living room could be described for my dough about 4 more times. It's so charming.
Do you know, Virginia, that for me, an old family man with 5 children, one of the most impressive pictures on the wall of that pine-panel living room was Franklin Delano Roosevelt surrounded, I think it must have been Christmas about 1940 or thereabouts, Franklin Roosevelt surrounded with, it must have been a dozen grandchildren. I don't know how many. I didn't have time to count them. How many does he have?
Well, I don't know. You know, when I spoke to Mrs. Roosevelt and asked her how many of her grandchildren were there this summer, she said only 9.
Only 9? That's wonderful.
I think probably there are about 15 or 16 by now.
Of course, the wonderfully informal picture of the recital is the fact that the baritone was singing, and between pauses, you could hear the children shouting from down by the lake. You could hear the bullfrogs croaking. You could hear the birds singing in the trees, and there was Fella barking, as I said yesterday, in tempo.
And you know whom I glimpsed through the doorway into the dining room was Mrs. Roosevelt's longtime secretary, Miss Malvina Thompson, who is a very lovely woman and goes right along in the tradition of informality of the Roosevelt household as we found the Roosevelt household. It's probably the most warm and informal and old-fashioned atmosphere in that household, an atmosphere of large families, a home where dogs and children are welcome and strangers are made to feel comfortable and at home. And Miss Thompson I saw going through the dining room, taking a last look, I suppose, at everything to see that it was all in order.
She was probably out in the kitchen, don't you think?
I imagine she was
the stew.
Floating around. Well, anyway, it was simply a delightful picture. And just about the middle of the recital, just between all the song groups, the baritone, Mr. James, and his accompanist retired to one side of the living room, and Mrs. Roosevelt got up very informally. She was sitting in the back of the room. She was about 3 chairs away from Ed Fuller and me, as I said before. And she walked down to the other end of the living room and stood very informally before the piano. And
yes, in that nice little book-lined alcove at the end of the living room. And there she stood in front of the piano and just talked very casually and informally to all of us who were there gathered as a sort of benefit to the Mount Holyoke $2 million fund. They're trying to build some new buildings. A chemistry building, I understand, and a physical education building. Isn't that right?
I think that's among their needs. And Mrs. Roosevelt chatted about woman's education.
Yes.
And these are some of the remarks. And now you're going to hear Mrs. Franklin Delano Roosevelt and some of what she said to us.
That's right.
The women of a country have really got within their hands what happens to their country in the social fields. And therefore it seems to me that we require today a far greater emphasis to be placed on the type of education that girls receive from the very young right through their college years. Because they set the tone of civilization. It's taken from what they stand for. And they have to have a standard, or they can't impart it. And they have to have it through understanding of what this world is like that they are trying to shape, because it is being shaped today, and it's being largely shaped by what the United States is. And so I think it is an increasingly interesting thing that women's colleges have smaller endowments, have a more difficult time to raise money, and an increasingly important thing for us to realize that it is just as important, the kind of education and the kind of opportunity that is offered to our women as it is that the greatest opportunity should be offered to our boys. Because though their contribution is often different, it is just as important. I get very much annoyed when I hear people always talking about equal rights, because I think equal rights should be taken for granted. But I don't think we should ever mix them and think that equal rights means no difference should exist. The contribution of a woman and the contribution of a man should complement each other. And in education, we should make the most of the things which women have to contribute, and see that they have a realization of their potentialities and that they develop them to the utmost, and not feel that it is a kind of constant competition between men and women. It isn't. It's a cooperation in the development of the highest potentialities for each, so that they may make of this nation the kind of leader in the world that is at present being waited for. We can't fool ourselves that we are today the leader that the world is waiting for. But we must become so. And I think much depends on the opportunities we give our young people, and on the kind of people to whom we entrust the shaping of the vision of those young people for the future. And that's why colleges for girls are just as important to me as colleges for boys, and schools are just as important. And I hope very much that everyone who is here will help in this drive, because it is the basis on which we build our future contribution to both a peaceful world and a developing world from the point of view of the social order in which we're going to live, and the cooperative world that we must hope for, because without it, we cannot build peace.
Well, Virginia, I thought it was very pleasant. After Mrs. Roosevelt finished her remarks about women's education and the need for greater endowments for women's colleges and the equality of rights and opportunity for women as against men, and the need for having women feel themselves as the leaders of the next generation, she just stood there by the piano and very casually and easily said, after the applause died down, "Now won't you all come in the dining room and have some tea?"
And it was a very, very pretty picture. The dining room table was set with a nice white cloth, and there were large glass punch bowls at either end of the table with iced tea in them and mint leaves floating around.
Oh, yes, so refreshing
delightful,
looking, wasn't it?
And very refreshing, because it was such a hot afternoon. And Mrs. Roosevelt presided over one bowl, and Miss Elaine Salpaugh, the chairman of the Mount Holyoke Fund Drive, presided at the other. And I thought the paper napkins were very pretty, Woody. They were so nice and summery looking. They were white scallop paper napkins with a big blue ER on them. And Mrs. Roosevelt was so gracious, and I might say that you distinguished yourself both as the recipient of iced tea and those elegant cookies, dear.
May I talk about those cookies for just an instant,
I think
Virginia?
you should.
If I have any gal friends in the world, Virginia, I hope they will someday serve me those same fat, nice, man-sized oatmeal cookies, of which I had plenty.
I should say you did. I was embarrassed. I heard Mrs. Roosevelt ask you 2 or at least 3 times if you'd have more tea, and each time you said certainly you would. And you also had cookies every time she asked you, and I thought, my goodness, maybe she'd think you hadn't eaten a meal for a week. You looked like it.
Yeah. Their guests, I thought, dispersed very nicely and quietly, Virginia, and everybody left the dining room and went out through the back door as they had come in, past the kitchen, which smelled very pleasantly.
Well, you know what, Woody? One of the maids came in to take some trays of glasses out, and I said to her, would you mind telling me what that delightful aroma that tantalized us all during the recital was in the kitchen? She said, well, it was our dinner cooking, and we're having beef stew and noodles and apple pie. And one woman who overheard this conversation said, oh, what a delicious and fattening dinner. I'd love to indulge in something like that. And I know just how she felt.
Well, I thought all in all, Virginia, it was a very pleasant afternoon. Saturday.
I did. I thought it was simply a delightful party, and the informality that began it also finished it, and Mrs. Roosevelt stood there very, very sturdily all through this long, hot afternoon, and she said goodbye to everyone, and then we all left and drove home up the 9G and up the Albany Post Road, and of course we had to stop.
And you had to stop off, of course, at the Lutheran Church to see what had happened to your exhibits in the Red Hook Garden Club Flower Show.
And I'm happy to report that nothing had happened to them. They were passed over as happily as if I hadn't even entered them, dear.
Well, of course, dear, the way you make arrangements bothers me a little bit. At the last minute, we must have an arrangement. Now, we've been too busy taking care of 5 children, running the house, and all the rest of it. So half an hour before the exhibit is supposed to open, you decide to make 3 arrangements to go into the show.
Well, I thought you were very thoughtful on Saturday when you pointed out to me that I have no eye for color or line, and I think you must have been right, dear.
I think you have no eye for proprieties either, Virginia. I mean, that miniature class that you sent in and exhibited, the one in which we had, forgive me, a little bit of baby's breath in that little tiny silver cup of Debbie's for the class which says, welcome the new baby. Along with the baby's breath, you also have 3 or 4 little flowers of deadly nightshade. How come?
Well,
don't you know what a deadly nightshade is?
Yes, I learned last year, but I knew that none of the babies were going to chew on this. It was simply an arrangement to be viewed, and I didn't have any blue flowers or pink flowers, so I went out in the meadow behind the farm and picked them, but I was very deceitful. I nipped off those long yellow pistils that would simply announce deadly nightshade to the waiting world, but I think the garden club judges were pretty smart. They probably recognized it as such and just disqualified me.
Just passed you right by as an ominous and malevolent woman, probably.
Woody, you know, last night...
Excuse me, dear.
Yes,
excuse
Christy?
me, dear. Just a moment. I was just going to say that the baby's breath in the little exhibit that you exhibited reminds me of those 2 new babies we have in our house.
Oh, aren't they cute?
Them?
Well, I think we're going to have all of our friends meet them maybe tomorrow, and we're also going to have them... Well, I don't know whether you'd say talk. Maybe cry for our listeners would be even better, because they're very vocal and articulate. They're almost like the Kloses. Did you hear Christopher just now yelling Mommy from upstairs?
I know. Our 2 new ones sound about like that.
Debbie is crying in her crib. I think I'm going to have to go upstairs and see about her. And you know, Woody...
oh, yes. Our friend is starring in the play tonight.
Our friend. They came from Bard College and borrowed our sofa. Oh, I have to go,
dear,
Woody.
You go. Yeah, you go. I'll take this out there. The point of the matter is that Virginia has to go upstairs and take care of baby Christy, 3 years old, who is having a little trouble at the moment. In any case, Virginia and I tonight are going to the Bard College Playhouse, which is the Straw Hat Experimental Theater up here at our local college, to see our prize sofa, right out of our study, play the leading role in Blythe's Spirit.
That's unfair to the leads. They're played by Ruth Altman and Thomas Palmer, and we're going to be very anxious to see the whole thing.
I'm sorry, we've got to leave the air. This is Woody Klose.
And Virginia.
We've been transcribing, chatting directly from Echo Valley Farm at Red Hook, New York. Goodbye.
Goodbye.